So, the Trojan War. We all know the story, right? It's this epic tale of gods, heroes, a giant wooden horse, and a city that burned to the ground. But behind all that poetry and all those larger-than-life characters, is there any truth? What if it wasn't just a story? Well, that's the big question we're going to tackle. You know, it all kicks off with this one word, rage. This is the very first line of Homer's Iliad, the epic poem that has pretty much defined our image of the Trojan War for almost 3,000 years. It's a story that's all about the unbelievable fury of its greatest warrior, Achilles. And for like 3,000 years, that's all anyone thought it was. Just an incredible story. I mean, a 10-year war fought by demigods over a stolen queen? It sounds like pure fantasy. But what if it wasn't just a story? What if there's a real historical event buried deep inside the legend? All right, so first things first, before we can even start digging for the truth, we've got to be on the same page about the myth itself, the story that Homer gave us. Okay, so the basic plot, it's epic stuff. You've got a massive alliance of Greek kingdoms, the Achaeans, who sail all the way to the city of Troy. Why? To get back one person, Helen. She was the wife of a Greek king, and she was taken by the Trojan prince, Paris. This sparks a war that just drags on for 10 brutal years and ends with Troy being completely wiped off the map. Okay, so if you're trying to prove this whole thing actually happened, where do you start? Well, you've got to find the city, right? For centuries, Troy was basically a ghost, lost to history. And then in the 19th century, one man's accession changed everything. Enter a guy named Heinrich Schliemann. And you got to understand, this guy wasn't your typical archaeologist. He was a super rich businessman who had been obsessed with Homer's poems since he was a kid. And he decided he was going to spend his fortune on one single thing: proving the Iliad wasn't a myth, it was history. But here's the thing about Schliemann. His methods? Oh man, they were a disaster. Seriously. Convinced that Homer's Troy had to be at the very bottom of this hill in Turkey, he didn't have time for careful digging. His brilliant idea? Dynamite. He literally blasted a huge trench right through the middle of the site, destroying who knows how many priceless artifacts in the process. And this is where it gets just tragic, really. See, Troy wasn't one city. It was like a layer cake of 9 cities built on top of each other over centuries. Schliemann found some treasure in a layer called Troy II and declared he'd found Homer's city. The problem? As you can see, that city is from around 2500 BCE. It's a full 1,000 years too old. The actual time period for the Trojan War is what we call Troy 6 or 7a, the very layers he dynamited right through. So, Schliemann might have found the right spot, but his unique approach caused huge problems. And as actual, careful archaeologists started working, a much bigger issue popped up. The world Homer described just didn't quite line up with what they were digging out of the ground. Okay, take funerals, for example. In the Iliad, it's all about these huge, dramatic funeral pyres, right? The heroes are always cremated. But when you look at the actual archaeological record from Bronze Age Greece, yeah, not so much. They almost always buried their dead. Cremation was super rare. That's a huge disconnect between the poem and the physical evidence. So what gives? Well, the consensus among scholars today is that the world of the Iliad isn't a perfect photograph of one single time period. It's more of a mishmash. You have to remember, these stories were passed down orally for hundreds of years before anyone wrote them down. So you get these echoes of the really old Bronze Age, but they're mixed in with details and technology from the later Iron Age, which is when the poets were actually living. And for a while, that seemed to be the answer. The war was just a fuzzy memory, a jumble of different eras. But then, a huge breakthrough came from somewhere nobody expected: the records of a rival empire. I mean, what if we could find someone else's records from that exact time? Not a poem, but like diplomatic cables, state archives. Well, it turns out we can. The archives of the Hittite Empire, a major superpower in the area, were holding an incredible secret. Okay, this right here, this is the bombshell. This is the game changer. Linguists digging through old Hittite clay tablets started noticing some incredible coincidences. They kept seeing references to a city over in western Anatolia called Wilusa. Sound familiar? It's a nearly perfect match for Wilios, the ancient Greek name for Troy. And guess who the Hittites were dealing with? A kingdom they called the Achiewa. I mean, come on. That's a dead ringer for Homer's Achaioi, the Greeks. And this wasn't just about similar-sounding names. These Hittite documents, and remember, they're from the exact time period we're talking about,
They describe ongoing political drama, even open conflict, between them and the Ahiawa, the Greeks. And it's all centered on the land of Wulusa, Troy. This is huge. It's outside confirmation from a totally different source of Greeks and Trojans clashing, right where and when the story says they did.
All right, so this Hittite stuff is amazing. It points to a real conflict. But what about the horse? You can't talk about the Trojan War without talking about the giant wooden horse. Was that real? Okay, so here's something that might blow your mind. The Trojan horse? It's barely even in the Iliad. Seriously, Homer's epic actually ends before the city falls, right after the funeral of the Trojan hero Hector. The whole famous story of the horse? That comes from later poems like Virgil's Aeneid, written like 1,000 years after the fact. So this has led people to wonder, what was the horse really? One theory is that it was a siege engine, like a giant battering ram, maybe shaped a bit like a horse and covered in wet horse hides so it wouldn't catch fire. Or what if it was a metaphor? See, the god Poseidon was the god of two things, horses and earthquakes. And guess what? Archaeology shows that Troy V was totally leveled by a massive earthquake. Coincidence? Or maybe it was just a great story, a poetic invention tacked on later to give the ending a bit more punch. All right, so let's step back and put this all together. We've got the epic poem, we've got the messy archaeology, and we've got these stunning Hittite records. So, what's the verdict? Was the Trojan War real? Let's just be blunt about it. The Trojan War, as described by Homer, the decade-long siege with demigods on the battlefield all because of Helen? Yeah, that almost certainly did not happen. The evidence just doesn't back up a story on that grand, epic scale. But, and this is the really important part, that does not mean nothing happened. Far from it. The evidence is now incredibly strong that a real, powerful city that we call Troy, or Wulusa, was the site of a major, very real conflict with Mycenaean Greeks, the Ahiawa, right around the end of the Bronze Age. So here's the best way to think about the Iliad. It's not a history textbook. It's a cultural memory. It's the powerful, poetic echo of a real, incredibly violent time in history, passed down from storyteller to storyteller for over 400 years. And with each telling, it got embellished, details got mixed up, and it became the legend we know today. And that leaves us with this incredible thought, right? The Trojan War wasn't true in a literal sense, but it was a story built around a core of forgotten history. And it just makes you wonder, how many of our other great myths are just the same, echoes of real history, just waiting to be rediscovered?